Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So, sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Now that most of you have distributed your 1099s to the vendors and filed the related forms to the IRS, it is fresh in your mind that there are some issues with your vendor master file. So, if you want a recommendation for how often you should be cleaning it and what tasks you should include, keep listening. Welcome to episode 324. How often should you clean your vendor master file? And 3 key tasks to include. So, I do want to say that I will have a link to a free training, and it's called 8 Steps to Clean Your Vendor Master File. So, make sure you check the show notes for that. But I do again want to talk about cleaning the vendor master file because, again, most of you, it is fresh in your mind after having to generate 1099s and the related tax filing that you might have some problems with your vendor master file. Some of you found duplicate vendors. Some of you found after doing the IRS 10 match, because, of course, you want to do that before you file your tax filings. 1099 tax reporting because you don't want to risk having penalties due to legal name tax ID mismatches that you're filing for your reportable vendors. But you're finding that, some of that information was not valid and you had to scramble, right, to get updated tax ID information from your vendors to get updated and make sure that was accurate. So now that it's fresh, and it's the best time to do it when it's fresh in your mind, let's talk about how often you should be cleaning your vendor master file. And then I have 3 key tasks that I think you need to include in that process. And I'm actually going to talk about those 3 things first, and then I'll talk about how often I recommend you need to be cleaning your vendor master file and why. So the first thing is cleaning the vendor master file. What are 3 key tasks that you need to be doing? And the first one is inactivating your vendors. And inactivating vendors means that you are inactivating vendors, not deleting, by the way, because if you had any transactions with them, you shouldn't be able to delete them anyway. But inactivating vendors that your company has not done business with in 15, 18, 24 months. I've seen some folks go to 36 months because at that point, the vendor's data, you can consider that as stale. You don't know that if you send a ACH payment or electronic payment that the bank details are still good. You don't know if you're sending a check payment that the check will get to the vendor, because you can't trust that the address is still good. And you need to make sure that you are updating that information. So the best way to do that is to inactivate those vendors again, not delete, just inactivate. And by the way, if you want to use those vendors again in the future, it only means that you select all the same information, all the same documents as you would a new vendor, because why? You're going to be validating that information all over again, because you inactivated them in the first place because that data was now stale. So you collect all the same information as a new vendor, and then you validate their information. And then if it's all good, the tax ID is still the same, you just reactivate that same vendor record. And if you need to update the vendor record, if the tax ID is still the same, you can do that at that time. Now, keep stressing the tax ID being the same, because if that tax ID is different, then you would leave that existing inactivated vendor record as it is, because you got to preserve that activity with that tax ID, because activity goes by tax ID. And then you will create another vendor record with the new tax ID and the current information or data for that vendor. Now, by the way, no one's going to like that, because if you've got existing feeds or something that's there, if it's still set up, even though the vendor is inactive, now you got to go change that. But that is really what needs to happen. So you do need to inactivate your vendors. And what I really like about that, and you can make it, I usually have it as the first step, but you can make it the last step if you want, only because uh, if your system won't let you like export in a report for to check for duplicate vendors, then you'll want to make sure that you include those vendors that you're either going to inactivate or that are inactivated already in the duplicate review. But I'm kind of getting ahead of that. But I always make this the first step, because it reduces the number of vendors that has to go through the remaining steps. Now, that's the first thing, is inactivating vendors. The second key task that you need to do is revalidate your vendor data. You know that some of your vendors won't tell you if things change. That's why you always do that bulk IRS 10 match before you report your reportable vendors to the IRS, right? Because you want to catch those legal name tax ID changes that your vendor didn't tell you about. Sometimes vendors get acquired, they will change their tax ID, they'll change their name. But if it doesn't affect their whatever change they're going through, if it doesn't affect their payments, they may not tell you. Or they might tell you, but then tell the person at your company that they have the relationship with, and then that information does not get to AP or the vendor team. So you always want to make sure you're revalidating your vendor data, and not just the IRS 10 match, but also the address, because you want to catch those addresses that were not standardized, so that it's not make sure that they are standardized in a format that makes them mailable, both US and non-US. Um, and speaking of that too, I talked about the IRS 10 match, but you want to make sure that you're checking where applicable, that your vendor's non-US tax registration number or registration number, be it tax, individual, business number, that is still valid as well. Unfortunately, you don't get a lot of bulk uploads for those types of registration numbers when they're non-US outside of the IRS 10 match, but those need to be done as well. And there are some third-party providers that have non-US validations. So you might want to check that out if you have a large volume of non-US vendors. All right, so IRS 10 match and other vendor registration numbers outside of the US, and then the address, and then also the watch list. And watch lists are very key because hopefully you are checking your vendors against the watch list at the time of vendor setup. Also recommend you do it whenever you change vendor existing information. So if a change request comes through, take that time, right, to do another IRS 10 match, even if it's not on the vendor legal name or tax ID. Take that time to do a watch list validation as well, because vendors can subsequently be added to these lists after you onboard them or after you uh, make any existing change to their record that they submitted. And so you want to make sure that you're always checking against these watch lists as often as possible. Some of you may have continuous monitoring that is provided by a third party. Some of you, it's a one by one lookup, right? Some of you have some resources to help you do that on a bulk basis. And I talked about having a link to that webinar, the free training, 8 steps to clean your vendor master file. I do have some recommended tools that'll help you do some of those things in bulk. So make sure you check that out. All right, so one was inactivating vendors, two was revalidating your vendor data. Now, the third thing, which again, you might have seen when you were preparing your 1099s to distribute to your vendors and for tax reporting, and that's duplicate vendors. And you might have seen that because they're a big old pain. Number one, it'll generate multiple, 1099 forms for the same vendor when it really should be one 1099. And so you may have to have gone back and corrected that. Also, these duplicate vendors, sometimes depending on your system, they may be required. And so I'm thinking about SAP, where duplicate vendors, especially for the ECC modules, are required because it's based on a relationship. So you'll have, for example, a VN vendor, which is like the header vendor record. Then you might have a remit vendor, which I forgot what that is. I think it's a PI, and then PI vendor. And then you have the OA vendor for the ordering addresses, right? And you may have multiple of OAs, PIs, right? And so with that, not a lot you can do to avoid duplicate vendors, but you still need to verify that they're not duplicate PIs, remit vendors that are truly duplicates. Sometimes you have to go and look at the type of payment type, because you will have to have a separate one for check payments, a separate one for um, bank or electronic payments, separate addresses for check payments. And so even if you have a system where you are required to have duplicate vendors, doesn't just have to be AP or SAP, but you may have a system that requires either duplicate vendors or duplicate addresses or duplicate locations. I'm thinking about systems like PeopleSoft, like Oracle, that requires duplicate site IDs, maybe for the same address, because one has a different set of payment terms, for example. So everyone can be a little bit different. Take a look at your system and identify what is a true duplicate vendor, duplicate address, duplicate location. And so you might have to look at multiple levels, to determine whether or not a vendor, an address, a location, for example, a site is truly a duplicate. But you do need to check for those duplicate vendors because, as we all know, duplicate vendors can lead to duplicate payments and it can be an indicator of fraud. Now, some other things that you may want to include as part of your vendor master file cleaning outside of these key tasks, three key tasks, which everyone should need to do. But there's some other things that you may need to throw in, right, for your particular industry, company, processes. And I'm thinking about things like collecting insurance certificates. Usually that's only required on an annual basis. Also, maybe a D&B credit history pull, right? So you may need to do that if that is something that your company does for your vendors. But the three key tasks of inactivating vendors, revalidating your vendor data, and checking for duplicate vendors should be something that all companies, all AP teams, all vendor teams, or maybe even procurement, if that's where the vendor function, vendor setup and maintenance function is. All right, so now that we've gone through the key things, let's talk about how often it needs to be done. And I'm going to start with the at least you should do it to what I really recommend. So there are four levels. The first one is annually. So at the very least, you should do the vendor master file cleanup on an annual basis. And if you're doing it annually, I do recommend that it be done at some point in September, Octoberish, because at that point, if you have any vendor validations that failed, especially the IRS 10 match, you have time to go back to the vendors and get that updated information before you have to do your 1099 tax reporting or even sending those 1099s to the vendors because you want to make sure that you're sending it to the right addresses. So you want to make sure that tax IDs are valid or the legal name tax ID combination is valid. And then also that the addresses are valid too if you're sending those out via regular US mail. Same thing if they're check payment vendors too. That doesn't really matter the time of the year. But if you're only doing it once, I recommend you do it September, October. The next level is semi-annually. And if you're doing it semi-annually, that's twice a year. Of course, I do recommend it be done September, Octoberish. But then the other time of the year I recommend to do it is sometime in quarter one. Because again, it's fresh in your head and your mind about what's wrong. And so now you can focus on those and you should have some downtime anyway now that you've got through your 1099s. I say that knowing full well that when I was an AP senior manager, I was working like, I don't know, 60, 70 hours a week. Couldn't even really get work done during the day because I was always in meetings. You go home, you plug up. And now here I'm saying, oh, you should have some time to clean your vendor master file. But you really do need to make sure either you're doing it or you assign someone to do it. And if you're doing it semi-annually, make it at least September, Octoberish, and then also I recommend quarter one. All right, the next level is quarterly, and this is 4 times a year. I really like quarterly because it's not too often, but it's enough so that you're not really tackling like semi-annually or annually or a big volume of vendors that didn't pass validation. So now you got a huge volume that you need to reach out to at one time or twice a year. Quarterly, it lets you do it, right? Reach out to those vendors that didn't match in the quarter one and then quarter two. You got a lesser volume of vendors because you've already checked them in quarter one. Same thing with quarter three. And by the time you get to quarter four, let's say that's October, and you're doing your IRS 10 match, you've got less vendors that you need to follow up on, especially if they are reportable vendors, because because you would have caught them or should have caught those that were inaccurate all year. Sometime between, quarter one and quarter three, you really only have to validate those that were, made changes in that short period of time. And you can even do it because later in the quarter, since you've been doing it all year long, quarterly, you can do it like November, maybe early December before you start with the um, year end rush, which typically for us used to happen right after Thanksgiving holiday. And so if you can get it done sometime between October and November, again, you should have a lighter volume that you have to follow up with because you've been doing it all year. Now, speaking of doing it all year, my recommendation of how often you should do it is the last level, and that is monthly. And the reason that I say monthly, outside of the fact that just like quarterly, you'll have less volume of vendors that you need to follow up with because you've been doing it on a monthly basis. This actually is because of watch lists, right? We talked about how vendors, hopefully you're checking them before you set them up at onboarding, and that's all fine and dandy. But vendors can be subsequently added to these watch lists. And if you do not have a continuous monitoring, then you have to make sure you're not paying vendors that were subsequently added to the watch list. And so if you think about how often your pay cycles are, that's really how often you need to be checking your vendors against watch lists. So if you don't have continuous monitoring, but you have a solution, there are some out there where you can upload your pay file and verify that the vendors that are in that current pay file are not on any watch list. That's perfect. Most of you I know don't have that. And so that's why I recommend on a monthly basis, because if you think about how many pay cycles you have, at least you will catch those, any vendors that have been subsequently added on a monthly basis. Now, this is something that if you have a large volume of vendors or a large volume of pay cycles, we used to have, but I worked for a Fortune 15 company, we had 125 pay cycles per week. That probably needs some continuous monitoring. But if you don't have, right, if you've got a regular size or that you consider, your leadership will consider not a large volume of pay cycles, then you should be able to get away with monthly if you are not able to get either continuous monitoring or a pay cycle check or a check of what against watch list for that current pay cycle, if I said that right. All right. So that's what I recommend. I recommend you clean your vendor master file monthly. And when you clean it, I recommend you inactivate vendors, you validate your vendor data, and you also check for duplicate vendors. Now, if you have other things, maybe you do those tasks not every month, but maybe annually. I talked about collecting insurance certificates, maybe the D&B credit history, or other tasks that you may need to do for your industry, your company, and your processes. Again, don't forget to check the show notes for the free training, 8 steps to clean your vendor master file, where I do include some resources for bulk uploads for some of those steps that you need to do when you clean your vendor master file. All right. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 324th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.